the whole idea of knowledge in ethics, as in the implication that there is some truth to be found in ethical principles, is a philosophically fraught idea and falls prey to the fact-value distinction as delineated by Hume. And the idea is that just because something is a certain way does not mean that it ought to be. Why? The is-ought distinction, the fact-value distinction. There is a separation, a gap, that cannot be closed between facts and values per se. They are indelibly different according to Hume, and there are some competing ideas in this space, but not very many good ones, and they're very difficult to make, and she makes none of them. So the fact that she's even trying to categorize ethics as a form of knowing truth is already philosophically fraught and problematic, even if she did try to make arguments to that effect, which she didn't. Welcome to the Clinical Appraisal Podcast. My name is Ian Lane, and on this show we discuss the science and theory of nursing. I'm a critical care nurse and PhD student in nursing science focused on measurement and methodology. Importantly, nothing I say constitutes nursing advice. This is education only. And if you want to get in touch with me, please email me at clinicalappraisal@gmail.com. If you want to donate to the show, links are in the description. And otherwise, like, comment, subscribe, and share the show if you enjoyed this episode. Barbara Carper was a nurse educator and theorist in Arizona, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, for a long time. This is one of the seminal works in the field of nursing education and nursing theory, and in particular was one of the foundational papers in the subdiscipline, so to speak, of nursing epistemology. I quote, or air quote, nursing epistemology because there seems to be a tacit understanding in the field that epistemology can be kind of subdivided in a way that lends itself to allowing nursing to have its own derivative of knowledge, as if our knowledge is unique and somehow different from the knowledge of other scientific disciplines. That is up for debate and continued discussion, even if the field would like us to believe that it's not, because philosophy of knowledge, and by that I mean epistemology, is complex. And I agree that it's at least a discussion worth having. And what better way to start having it than by going over this infamous paper by Dr. Carper. People know this paper by its colloquial title, which is Carper's Ways of Knowing. Carper's ways of knowing are fourfold. I'm going to give you the four basic ways of knowing according to Carper, according to this paper, which I'll go through with you today. They are basically empirical knowledge, that is not knowledge that's discovered through the scientific enterprise of nursing science, nursing research. Then there is the aesthetic way of knowing, which is essentially the art of nursing. And then there is the purported personal knowledge or personal knowing, or the way of knowing through personal experience, which is somehow purportedly distinct from the other two. And then there is moral knowledge, ethical nursing knowledge, because the fact-value distinction has been solved through nursing theory. Let's dig in. If you haven't caught my somewhat annoyed sarcasm, or facetiousness rather, you might be able to tell that I think this is one of the dumbest papers I've ever read in my entire life. And facetiousness be damned, let's dive right in. Typically, my usual way of doing this, or going about this type of review, is to make all sorts of hedging statements about my respect and admiration for the thinker involved. And while that's normally the case, here I have have only the implicit respect I have for other people generally, because the thinking involved in this is relegated to the other people that Dr. Carper cites in this paper. She cites McKay, she cites Dewey, I believe, of the American Pragmatists. She cites Maslow. She cites all sorts of people. It all begins with, according to so-and-so, XYZ seems to be true. Completely disjointed from anything in the paper that's actually relevant to what she's saying. She provides no descriptions or definitions of anything she talks about. And we, as readers, are left to assume and wonder and make our own judgment calls. And it baffles me why people are as obsessed with this particular paper as they are. So I'm going to do what I did the last time. I'm going to read particular pieces of this document and provide some feedback based on the things that I'm reading. I'm going to hope that some of the things I'm doing here will provide some context for her ideas, and I'm going to try my best where it is possible to steel man what I think she's trying to say, couched in the understanding that most of this paper is incomprehensible and not in some Heideggerian or Hegelian sense in philosophy where it's just so complex and just evades like common knowledge and common language that it's impossible for the layperson to read without extensive experience and work in philosophical writing. Like, it's not like that at all. It's just ridiculous. Okay. It is the general conception of any field of inquiry that ultimately determines the kind of knowledge the field aims to develop, as well as the manner in which that knowledge is to be organized, tested, and applied. Give me a second. Apologies. By this, she just means that the discipline determines the content of knowledge to be gained, but she wants it to be flowery. Now, as we go down, the body of knowledge that serves as the rationale for nursing practice has patterns, forms, and structure that serve as horizons of expectations and exemplify characteristic ways of thinking about phenomena. I don't know what you make of that sentence, but what I make of that sentence is I want to use a lot of flowery language to say basically just that knowledge underpinning nursing has characteristic patterns. And then she goes on to say that understanding them is essential for the practice of nursing. So just say that. So according to Carper, 4 fundamental patterns of knowing have been identified from, quote, an analysis of the conceptual and syntactical structure of nursing knowledge. So that one that's here, that's citation number 1, that's her dissertation. That's not a published paper. This paper is the published paper. You would think this paper would have the analysis in it. It doesn't. And I can't find that dissertation, abstract, or anything else anywhere. So I have no idea. I've tried ProQuest dissertations. I've tried a bunch of different avenues. I cannot find this dissertation in full. I want to know how she did this analysis. I want to know how this was actually conducted methodologically. Even a description of her methodological inquiry in this paper, this fundamental seminal work, you would think would be implied. And it's not. It's not here. It's not present, and I can't find it. So this paper sets the stage for nursing epistemology, which everybody in our field talks about. I've had multiple guests on the show that talk about the epistemology of nursing, this special, unique, some of them go on to say the ontology of nursing. That's fine if you can provide a justification for that. And if your justification for nursing epistemology is this paper, and this paper has no methodological analysis whatsoever, or rather a description of her methodological approach, then what am I to take from that except for this is just Carper's opinion? Fine. The 4 patterns are distinguished according to logical type of meaning and designated as 1, empirics, the science of nursing, 2, aesthetics, the art of nursing, 3, the component of a personal knowledge in nursing, and 4, ethics, the component of moral knowledge in nursing. I discussed that with you already at the beginning, and the question remains in my mind, how were these 4 things derived? Let me take a second to tell you how you should derive these 4 things, right? Here's what I think you should do. And of course, there might be a couple different derivative ways of doing this that are at least on par methodologically and are appropriate enough. But for this type of really high level theoretical theory development, essentially, I think the best way to do this would be to conduct a Delphi study of expert nurses, of nurse educators, of theorists, and come together to create a qualitative typology that from the outset that could then be distilled into a model that is at least sensible, that high-level nursing theorists and educators and expert clinicians in nursing agree upon, and then do a confirmatory factor analysis or continue to do a CFA within a structural equation model or something that then actually validates your model. You don't get to claim that your model is true without having done some kind of validation study. The point I'm making here is I can't find out how she validated this because she doesn't describe it, and her dissertation is nowhere to be found. And that's the only thing besides this paper that describes that, hypothetically, that describes that methodology. But it's not here, so where is it? And if she didn't do it, then this is just her opinion. And we'll go into the specifics despite that, because this is a seminal work in the field. I'm only annoyed by this, and I am actually annoyed by this. I'm annoyed by this because this is treated as the seminal paper it is. And I don't think people actually read this paper, and if they do, I don't think they do it with a critical eye. So, empirics, the science of nursing, this is the first kind of foundational way of knowing, according to Carper. Quote, since the 1950s, there has been an increasing emphasis, one might even say a sense of urgency, regarding the development of a body of empirical knowledge specific to nursing. Okay. There seems to be a general agreement that there is a critical need for knowledge about the empirical world, knowledge that is systematically organized into general laws and theories for the purpose of describing, explaining, and predicting phenomena of special concern to the discipline of nursing. There's general agreement on this problem because science, broadly speaking, physics, chemistry, biology, have proven themselves empirically valuable to society. They've been able to make predictions that come true in evolution, in genetics, in quantum mechanics, in relativity, in the ideal gas law, etc., etc., etc. There are very profound reasons why socioculturally the West has started to rely on empirical science. It's because it's predictive, it's explanatory, and it works. If it didn't, physics would not be able to lend itself to engineers to build functional bridges and buildings, and unfortunately bombs and things like that. It's clear that science can go awry too. But the fact is that with physics and biology and chemistry, you can make predictions about the world. And those predictions, generally speaking, if done well, rigorously, come true. Look at that. Now, if, as medicine has done, you start to see this social value embraced by biomedicine and biomedical implications, begin to show themselves in the medical literature, and evidence starts to show different interventions have different evidence base for them, and varying levels of evidence, and yada yada yada. We could talk about medical evidence on a different podcast for ages, but the point is, as medical evidence has started to be integrated into medical practice, and the science of medicine was starting to be or the science of biomedicine, if you wish, started to develop, then, of course, the field of nursing, which historically relied on word of mouth and mythological stories from nurse to nurse throughout the ages, started to go, well, shit, We practice with patients too, and we have a form of practice that we could test empirically and find out what things work and what things don't, and as we should. Moving on. Most theory development and research efforts are primarily engaged in seeking and generating explanations which are systematic and controllable by factual evidence, which can be used in the organization and classification of knowledge. That's because science is about prediction. And if we want nursing to be a science, then we need to be able to predict that our interventions will actually lead to some outcome that we actually desire for patients, or that in our case, that patients actually desire for themselves. But that necessitates a kind of empirical evidence base that we won't have unless we actually attain the scientific status using a scientific methodology. So far, she hasn't bothered to actually describe what she means by empiricism. I just want to point that out, because this is a theoretical paper. The philosophy, you would think, would be described, and it's not. It's left to our own devices to make assumptions, or we are left to our own devices to make assumptions. We're left looking at some of the implications in this paper, and we're supposed to take this at face value. And what I'd like to see from an analysis from a philosophical vantage point in a theoretical paper is a description of what exactly she means when she says empirical. What is empiricism? Provide a definition, even one definition. This is a seminal work, don't forget, in our field. Let's continue on here. If you're watching on YouTube, I apologize about all the scrolling. So there is a comment that she makes. She says, I want to make sure I'm not... Okay, yes. She says, the task of the natural history stage of the science of nursing is primarily the description and classification of phenomena which are, generally speaking, ascertainable by direct observation and inspection. I circled this third citation because, remember, citation number 1 is her dissertation, which I can't find. Citation number 3, which is about this descriptive and classificatory stage of nursing science, that citation is Northrup's The Logic of Science and Humanities, and has nothing at all to do with nursing or nursing science. And it's used here as a sort of justification for the idea that nursing science is based in this stage, the natural history stage, on description and classification. Also, mind you, without having described what empiricism is, without having described what science is per se, and what nursing science is per se, because there's no definition in this paper about what nursing science is. There's actually no description of what nursing is, now that I think about it. I've read this paper like 17 times, and I can't pull out a concrete definition of nursing or nursing science according to Carper. Current nursing literature clearly reflects a shift from this descriptive and classification form to increasingly theoretical analysis, which is directed towards seeking or inventing explanations to account for observed and classified empirical facts. Classified? Sure. This shift is reflected in the change from a largely observational vocabulary to a new, more theoretical vocabulary whose terms have a distinct meaning and definition only in the context of the corresponding explanatory theory. Sure. This shift is reflected in the change from a largely observational vocabulary to a new, more theoretical vocabulary whose terms have a distinct meaning and definition only in the context of the corresponding explanatory theory. So what she's saying is that she's personally noticed a shift in vocabulary here. And that's what it seems like to me anyway, that she's using personal anecdote and her experience as an educator, a theorist, I'm not really sure, as a nurse, as a person in society at that time. This was published in 1978 in Advances in Nursing Science. Sorry, I didn't say that earlier. Why this should mean anything to us as readers who can't verify this, I have no idea why I should take this seriously. Quote, Explanations in the several open system conceptual models tend to take the form of commonly labeled functional or teleological. Two things. One, I have no idea what she means by open system conceptual models. Two, she uses the terms functional and teleological, which are philosophical terms that she, yet again, doesn't bother to describe. What we need here is a definition of what functional and what teleological is from a philosophical standpoint, how it relates to philosophy of science, and then how it relates to nursing science in particular. None of that has been afforded to us. So, I'm failing to see the connection of what this has to do with philosophy of nursing science in particular. A teleological explanation, for those that are interested, is something that involves something that describes the purpose of a thing, whereas a functional description discusses the function of that thing or what it's doing. So, for example, the heart is pumping blood, which is circulating throughout the body to keep the body tissues, alive. And it's the heart beating that causes blood to circulate to keep things nourished distally to the heart. That's a functional description. A teleological description is that the heart beats for the purpose of keeping the organism alive. But how that relates, she doesn't say. So, moving on, I guess. Quote, the first fundamental pattern of knowing in nursing is empirical, factual, descriptive, and ultimately aimed at developing abstract and theoretical explanations. It is exemplary, discursively formulated, and publicly verifiable. Let's talk about this. Empirical, factual, and descriptive are not synonymous. Like, she didn't describe what she means by empiricism or empirical. She doesn't talk about what she means when she says fact, because there's a whole philosophical literature on what constitutes truth and how a fact might be the same or different from truth. I don't know what meaning she expects me to derive from this from a theoretical perspective or a philosophical perspective, given that she's not described any of these things. And science can be descriptive, but it can also be explanatory. And I don't know how these are the same or different. We are left to assume, based on what she's saying here, that they're the same. The other thing is, I have no idea why she thinks that it is exemplary makes sense. Like, I don't know, is that the social bias coming out there, that like our social system or like societally we expect scientific empiricism to be exemplary? That comment's not made anywhere. I've got no idea where that comes from. She just likes to use flowery language in this to sound smart. Discursively formulated. So when I hear empirical nursing science is discursively formulated, what it tells me is that nursing science arrives through discussion, through discourse. Okay. And it is publicly verifiable. That's the only one that I can actually get behind, because publicly verifiable implies verification, which implies actually being able to replicate something, which implies a methodology. But all these implications, and nothing's ever actually explicitly stated in a way that's meaningful or makes a lot of sense. So there's that. And on top of this, the whole idea of verification is an important part of philosophical empiricism and empirical science. And yet there's no discussion in this paper of what she means when she says verification. So, or verifiable, to be more specific. So that was her whole section on empiricism as the first fundamental way of knowing. Number one, you'll notice that she didn't describe or define empiricism. She barely described what nursing science aimed to do, kind of, let alone what she thinks it is. Didn't describe what nursing is. and ultimately didn't describe how that pattern of knowing was found or discovered or validated. Moving on to number 2, the art of nursing, or aesthetics. Quote, one is almost led to believe that the only valid and reliable knowledge is that which is empirical, factual, objectively descriptive, and generalizable. This piece of the second foundational way of knowing, the art of nursing, I think harkens to her writings on empirical nursing above, the idea that empiricism is about reliable knowledge that's empirical, factual, blah, 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 generalizable, and that, we really think that's like the only way to know things. Well, she doesn't cite anything there, so I don't know what she's referring to, but what I can assume she's referring to is the fact that a lot of philosophers of epistemology, or epistemics generally, believe that knowledge is one of two things. There are multiple other kind of philosophical theories of knowledge, namely skepticism is one of them. One of the other ones I'm not going to talk about, which states that we actually don't have and can't have knowledge, and there is no such thing as knowledge, maybe. Or if there is, we don't have access to it. And if you think you do, they're skeptical of that. It's much more complex than that makes it sound. There are days where I find myself sympathetic to the skeptical view, but the two kind of prominent views that stand out in my mind, and I'm not an epistemologist by any stretch of the imagination, is justified true belief and empiricism as knowledge. So justified true belief says, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, says that knowledge can be had only if the facts that you claim to know are justified or justifiable, that they're true, and that you believe them. That's one thing. The problem with JTB is that you end up in an infinite regress. It's, as the philosophers say, it's turtles all the way down. That's something that, again, I'll leave you to look up on your own, because I'm already going to be over time, I think, on this. I'm going to try to speed through. The idea that empirical experiences and understanding of reality are constitutive of knowledge is like the leading, at least in science, the leading philosophy of epistemology, of epistemics. Whether or not I agree that empirical facts are constitutive of knowledge per se, especially if they're derived from scientific empiricism, I'm just, like I say, I'm not an epistemologist, and I'm not enough of an epistemologist to make any hardball claims. But what I can say here is that this content is predicated on the idea that everybody assumes that knowledge is empirical in nature. She goes on to say, there is nonetheless what might be described as a tacit admission that nursing is, at least in part, an art. Now, here's what I think she means, and I'm going to try to be charitable for a second. I'm going to go back to not being charitable very soon, so bear with me. But when she says a tacit admission that people agree that nursing is an art as much as a science, people say that about medicine too, the art of medicine, the art of nursing, the art of whatever, physical therapy, the art of... I think what they mean is practice variance between clinicians, because you can interpret the science in different ways and thus apply the science in different contexts in different ways for different patients. Fair enough. But what about that constitutes an art form? Does anyone actually believe that it's an art form, or is that just a use of language that's colloquially easy because it gets at the point that it's not science? But is anything that's not science automatically art? Or is it automatically beautiful? Because I fail to see how that's the case. So I think what she's saying is that colloquially, people tend to tacitly admit that some of what we do is just not science because it's out of the context in which the science was studied for that patient or that patient population or whatever the case may be in that specific context. And that part's true. What I would say is not clear and necessarily true is that it's art. Because A, you've not described why nursing is art. And for the record, she doesn't go on to describe how nursing is art. And I've never seen any compelling explanation by anybody of how or why nursing is art. And I forgot what I was going to say next about the art thing. Except, personally, I think it's more... maybe this was what I was going to say. The idea that it's... Not only did she fail to describe like why this is art just because it's not science, I think people tend to assume that there is something creative in that variance, in the variability in practice. And I think that part's true. But that speaks to the variability in application of the science in different contexts, which I don't know the degree to which you would say that that's beautiful, which I think is implied in art. Again, I'm not an esthetician by any stretch of the imagination, so I don't really have an answer to this, but I think most people who study the philosophy of art and aesthetics would admit that beauty has something to do with art. Beauty, satisfaction, something like that. And I don't know the degree to which we would say clinical practice variance is beautiful. I guess it can be pleasing in some ways and displeasing in other ways. But is that ethical disgust, moral disgust, or is that, lack of beauty? And are they related? Like, all of this is up in the air, and it is not at all clear to me how this relates to the possibility that just because some of the knowledge that we have, according to Carper, doesn't fit science, that automatically means it defaults to being art. I think that what this sort of not scientifically derived component of practice variance is more like engineering. It's more akin to engineering outcomes based on limited scientific context and the extrapolation of that science to other patient populations and other contexts. Quote, "Perhaps this reluctance to acknowledge the aesthetic component as a fundamental pattern of knowing in nursing originates in the vigorous efforts made in the not-so-distant past to exercise the image of the apprentice-type education system. Within the apprentice system, the art of nursing was closely associated with an imitative learning style and the acquisition of knowledge by accumulation of unrationalized experiences." I don't quite understand what she's trying to say here in terms of the relation to art and art-based knowledge, but I just want to make one comment, which is, what artist in training doesn't first begin by imitating their instructor? And the implicit assumption here is that imitation isn't constitutive of artistic knowledge in nursing somehow. She's not clear. If you've not noticed, she's not a very clear writer. And if you're not a clear writer, you're not typically a clear thinker either. Quote, White's suggested, here's the first place that, at least that I've highlighted, that I've read, that she cites somebody else to justify one of her claims. White's suggests that art is too complex and variable to be reduced to a single definition. So fantastic. She's now going to use this quote from somebody else, or this paraphrased comment from somebody else, to wiggle her way out of having to define art and define its relationship to nursing knowledge. So it's just too complex and variable to say anything about. So I'm just going to make a bunch of claims that are disjointed and have nothing to do with any definitions, because I don't have to give you any definitions because it's just too complicated. Quote, I guess I'm going to have to read a little bit farther out. This fluid and open approach to the understanding and application of the concept of art and aesthetic meaning makes possible a wider consideration of conditions, situations, and experiences in nursing that may properly be called aesthetic, including the creative process of discovery in the empirical pattern of knowing. Who defines art in this way, as the creative process of discovery in the empirical pattern of knowing? Moving on, quote, the recognition that art is expressive rather than merely formal or descriptive, according to Rader, another person she cites, because she doesn't think for herself, apparently, according to her own paper, is about as well established as any fact in the whole field of aesthetics. In this context, this implies that empirical truths can't be expressive and beautiful, but it also implies that artistic truths are not formal or descriptive. And that makes absolutely no sense unless you're going to justify that, and she doesn't. Quote, knowledge gained by empirical description is discursively formulated and publicly verifiable. I assume this is where she starts to summarize. The knowledge gained by subjective acquaintance, just keep that in the back of your mind. She never described what subjective acquaintance is. She never delineated subjective from objective. She just assumes that you know, because how could you not? And acquaintance, subjective acquaintance. Sure. Quote, the direct feeling of experience. I guess that's what subjective acquaintance is. The direct feeling of experience defines discursive formulation. Let me read that again, because I cannot stop being a jerk in the middle of my reading this sentence. Quote, knowledge gained by empirical description is discursively formulated and publicly verifiable. The knowledge gained by subjective acquaintance, the direct feeling of experience, defines discursive formulation. Although an aesthetic expression required abstraction, it remains specific and unique rather than exemplary, and leads us to acknowledge that knowledge, genuine knowledge, understanding, is considerably wider than our discourse. So she just said a few paragraphs ago that the highest form of empirical nursing science is to generate abstract theoretical ideas and models. But now she's saying the highest expression of aesthetic knowledge is abstraction. Okay. Continuing on, here she cites someone else. This is actually the first female, I believe, that she cites. Weidenbach, who's actually a nurse, for Weidenbach, the art of nursing is made visible through the action taken to provide whatever the patient requires to restore or extend his ability to cope with the demands of his situation. But the action taken to have an aesthetic quality requires the active transformation of the immediate object, the patient's behavior, into a direct, non-mediated perception of what is significant in it. That is, what need is actually being expressed by the behavior. There are so many things here. One, what the hell are we talking about when we say non-mediated perception? She doesn't describe, first of all, if you're a researcher, you know what mediation is, but suffice it to say that from a colloquial perspective, mediation is like a cause. It's like a cause and effect arrow, except that it's more like A causes C, but only with B. B is the mediating factor for A to cause C. How that relates to perception, which she doesn't define in this context, because when I hear perception, having studied psychology and behavioral science, I think of something very specific. What she's saying here for perception as you read on throughout the paper, doesn't have seemingly anything to do with my understanding of what perception is. Maybe define it first in your paper, which she doesn't do. But of course, this is something that she's taking from Weidenbach, so maybe we can forgive her for that for the sake of this particular kind of segment of the paper, assuming that she goes on to describe it a little bit better a little bit later. She doesn't. So I don't know what non-mediated perception is. I also fail to see how this constitutes artistic knowledge in nursing. Quote, the aesthetic process described by Weidenbach, which wasn't described, resembles what Dewey refers to as the difference between recognition and perception. Here's again where she's going to take another philosopher, Dewey, presumably from the American School of Pragmatists, to describe something that Dewey said, because she doesn't think for herself, apparently. This is supposed to be the equivalent of a PhD dissertation condensed into one paper. This was, call it 4 years of postgraduate, post-baccalaureate study in a very particular area of nursing theoretical understanding and education for her EDD. And she is just going to refer to other people's ideas throughout her entire paper. Got it. According to Dewey, recognition serves the purpose of identification and is satisfied when a name tag or label is attached according to some stereotype or previously formed scheme of classification. Perception, however, goes beyond recognition in that it includes an active gathering together of details and scattered particulars into an experienced whole for the purpose of seeing what is there. It is the perception rather than mere recognition that results in a unity of ends and means which gives the action taken an aesthetic quality. I would read that again for you, but I don't want you to tear your goddamn hair out of your head. I don't have any way of making sense of what that means, because she doesn't describe recognition. She doesn't define them, rather. She doesn't define perception, according to Dewey. She just goes on to talk about what Dewey says about perception. And it's totally disjointed from any context that would be recognizable to anybody. For the sake of this, it's sort of just pasted in here as if we're supposed to be able to make sense of it, with flowery language that means nothing out of context. But okay, let's continue, shall we? One of the most seminal papers that it's ever been published in nursing theory, and the fundament of nursing epistemology, right here. Quote, Oram, referring to Dorothea Oram, speaks of the art of nursing as being expressed by the individual nurse through her creativity and style in designing and providing nursing that is effective and satisfying. End quote. I like Dorothy Oram. I think Dorothy Oram is a good thinker and was a great theorist and has lent some ideas that are to this day still useful for the field of nursing, which most nursing theorists cannot say. And yet, I would still say that for this particular quote here, the most charitable argument you could make for the aesthetic knowledge of the art of nursing is through the creativity and style piece that she describes here in designing and providing nursing practices that in her case are, quote, effective and satisfying. The problem with that in terms of knowledge generation is that effective and satisfying are outcomes that are studied empirically. And I think Oram knew that because Oram devised a theory that could be tested and testable empirically. But Carper is trying to utilize that idea as evidence for an aesthetic way of knowing. Continuing on, quote, the art of nursing is creative in that it requires development of the ability to envision valid modes of helping in relation to results which are appropriate, Sure. This again invokes Dewey's sense of a perceived unity between an action taken and its result, a perception of the means of the end as an organic whole. I don't even know what I want to say about that. The experience, quote, of helping must be perceived and designed as an integral component of its desired result, rather than conceived separately as an independent action imposed on an independent subject. Perhaps this is what is meant by the concept of nursing the whole patient or total patient care. If so, what are the qualities that enable the creation of a design for nursing care that eliminate or would minimize the fragmentation of means and ends? I think that is kind of nice, but I fail to see how it's any evidence whatsoever of aesthetic ways of knowing and how it constitutes its own dimension in a typology of epistemological knowledge. Quote, empathy, that is, the capacity for participating in or vicariously experiencing another's feelings. Hey, the first definition I've seen her put here. It's also not a very good definition of empathy. Is an important mode in the aesthetic pattern of knowing. Okay, sure. So the case she's making here is that, or no, the case she's not making here, the claim she's making here is that empathy is artistic. Or aesthetic, rather. My question for her is, could you please make the case that that is the case? Justify your argument that empathy is aesthetic knowledge. One gains knowledge of another person's singular, particular felt experience, in other words, another person's experience, through empathic acquaintance. You become acquainted through your own empathy with their personal experience by virtue of your relationship with them, I suppose. And again, this isn't an argument. This is just a claim. This is just an unverifiable statement that to me is nonsensical and unjustified. Quote, empathy is controlled or moderated by psychic distance or detachment in order to apprehend and abstract what we are attending to, and in this sense is objective. We're going to come back to that in a second. That's my favorite part in the whole paper. The more skilled the nurse becomes in perceiving and empathizing with the lives of others, the more knowledge or understanding will be gained of alternative modes of perceiving reality. Unquote. So there's an argument, a syllogistic argument that can be extracted from the beginning of this. Quote, empathy is controlled or moderated by psychic distance or detachment in order to apprehend and abstract what we are attending to, and in this sense is objective. End quote. That's an argument. It's an actual argument. That's the first actual argument she's posed so far. Ignoring the fact that I disagree with her definition of empathy, because we'll just set that aside for a second. And I should point out, as a methodologist, she actually does use moderated appropriately here, but she says controlled or moderated. She should just pick one of those words. And people usually will only say moderated if they're writing a methods section or discussing statistics or theory, as in like theory construction, theory development. She should just use controlled, personally. Here's the argument she makes. Premise 1, this is a syllogism, by the way. Premise 1. Empathy is controlled, moderated, by psychic distance/detachment. Premise 2. This distance is modified in order to apprehend, abstract, what we are attending to. Conclusion. Therefore, empathy is objective. Can you make sense of that argument? When you evaluate a syllogism, typically what you do is you evaluate the truth value of each premise in the syllogism. Ask yourself, is the statement, empathy is controlled by psychic detachment, true? If you agree on what she means by psychic detachment and controlled and empathy, that could be true. Number 2, premise 2, do you agree that this is true? quote, this quote is mine. This distance is modified in order to apprehend or abstract what we are attending to. I don't know what that even means. Clearly, I know what she means by attention, attending to, in a way, kind of. I don't understand what she means by apprehend or abstract what we are attending to. I think I can make assumptions on what's implied behind apprehending attention in an abstract way, like creating a mental concept or category that you're abstracting out of the attention you're fixating on a particular moment in time of something that you're perceiving. But that's all implied. That's not something that she's saying explicitly. That's all just like possibilities of what she might mean. And then she goes on to say, therefore, empathy is objective. And then what? That empathy, because it's artistic and aesthetic, is evidence that knowledge from aesthetic means are objective knowledge? Like, ignoring the syllogism for a second, which makes no sense to me at all from the second premise and the conclusion, is the attempt to use the syllogism to say that, therefore, if empathy is aesthetic knowledge derived from this interpersonal relationship and empathic subjective acquaintance, that therefore abstract artistic knowledge is therefore objective. Like, sorry, I used therefore like 13 times. I don't know how anybody can read that and come away thinking that this is one of the most fundamental things they've ever read in our field. Forgive me. Quote, the nurse will thereby have available a larger repertoire of choices in designing and providing nursing care that is effective and satisfying. At the same time, increased awareness of the variety of subjective experiences will heighten the complexity and difficulty of the decision-making involved. But is this art? Or is this science or engineering or something altogether distinct? Is it knowledge at all? Or is it just practice variance between clinicians? And what makes this an art and how it's related to knowledge? She doesn't make any of those things clear. She summarizes this second way of knowing. Quote, the aesthetic pattern of knowing in nursing involves the perception of abstracted particulars as distinguished from the recognition of abstracted universals. It is the knowing of a unique particular rather than an exemplary class. Let's work backwards. At what point in this paper did she make the claim that something other than aesthetic ways of knowing constitute an exemplary class? The only one we've talked about is empiricism. At what point did she talk about empirical nursing science being exemplary class knowledge? Then let's talk about the abstracted particulars versus abstracted universals. Ignoring the fact that she didn't describe what she means by abstracted anything, but I assume that looking at the special particulars as they constitute the holistic, subjectively acquired perceptions that she and more likely Dewey talked about. I don't even know if Dewey would agree with this bullshit. Excuse my language. I don't even know what to make of it. Is the abstracted universal supposed to be reflective of the empirical side, whereas the abstracted particulars she never describes in this paper are constitutive of the aesthetic way of knowing? This whole paragraph makes no sense. Number 3, the third way of knowing. The component of personal knowledge, personal knowing. I think that some of nursing's compulsion toward standpoint epistemology comes from this paper, from this section of this paper in particular. Standpoint epistemology is essentially the It's kind of like a sub-classification of skeptical epistemics, I think, anyway, that I think derives from postmodern thought that there are different forms of personal knowledge based on your own, quote, lived experience, unquote. And I think there are arguments for standpoint epistemology, none of which are made in this paper. And we'll set aside standpoint epistemology for now and just talk about her like personal knowing. Except I think the idea that empiricism can be juxtaposed with personal knowing and standpoint epistemology at face value as if they're somehow distinguishable at face value without, I don't know, demonstrating that somehow is beyond me. We're almost done, I promise. I won't torture you for too much longer. I think I'm just feeling tortured because I've read this paper like 13 times to try to get a sense of what am I missing? Why am I too stupid to understand this brilliant work that has laid the foundation for scientific epistemology in nursing? And I'm beginning to think that maybe I'm not the stupid one. Quote, certainly the phrase therapeutic use of self, which has become increasingly prominent in the literature, the nursing literature, implies that the way in which nurses view their own selves and the client is of primary concern in any therapeutic relationship. Ignoring that this whole paper is like a bunch of disjointed quotes that don't go together, that are from other people, that are half relevant and made up her whole dissertation, according to this paper, which is the thing that synthesized her dissertation into a coherent set of thoughts. And the fact that this is one of the most famous papers that's ever been written in our field is insane. This is the start of the argument that personal knowledge or personal knowing somehow underpins nursing knowledge and practice in some way that's distinct from empirical knowledge. But how that's the case is not described. Even if this statement about therapeutic use of self is related to personal knowing, that experience with another person is still an empirically describable interaction. Quote, personal knowledge is concerned with the knowing, encountering, and actualizing of the concrete individual self. One does not know about the self. One strives simply to know the self. Okay. I can hardly read that without going red. This means nothing to me. And I don't know if you take something super important away from this, but knowing about the self and knowing the self, like maybe you could make a distinction between those two things, but you'd have to work really hard philosophically to make that argument. And she doesn't do any of that work here whatsoever. And then again, she makes this comment about like actualizing the concrete, but doesn't describe what she means when she decides to use words like actualize. And we're talking about these like abstract ideas, but then she's talking about concrete ideas, and she keeps flowing back and forth between abstractions and concreteness and just completely unjustified ways of talking, because there's no transitions, no explanations, no nothing. It's all disconnected, disjointed, and nonsensical. Then she takes another male, nonetheless, philosopher. Ironically, if I were Peggy Chin or sympathetic with Peggy Chin's ideas, which I'm not, but if I were, I should clarify, Peggy Chin's ideas about the maleness of science, the male-defined empirical science. I'd have to laugh at this point because the philosophers and the theoreticians that she's using in this paper, that Carper is using in this paper, are mostly men. So is Carper's ways of knowing aka the fundament of nursing epistemology, male defined. That's hilarious. Martin Buber, a male philosopher, she goes on to use some of his thoughts completely disconnected from anything we've talked about at all, other than the fact that the I-thou, Buberian relationship is discussed at the point where she's talking about like an interpersonal dynamic here. She says, quote, "This I-thou encounter is unmediated by conceptual categories or particulars abstracted from complex organic wholes." She still doesn't talk about what she means by particulars. I have no idea what she means by unmediated by conceptual categories. And maybe Martin Buber talks about unmediated conceptual categories in his I-thou book. That's several hundred page philosophical, famous philosophical text, I-thou, by Buber, but she doesn't set the stage for that here, so I have nothing to go on at all. Please feel free to ignore the sounds of my cat in the background. Quote, "The nurse in the therapeutic use of self rejects approaching the patient client as an object and strives instead to actualize an authentic personal relationship between two persons. The individual is considered an integrated, open system incorporating movement toward growth and fulfillment of human potential. An authentic personal relation requires the acceptance of others and their freedom to create themselves and the recognition that each person is not a fixed entity, but constantly engaged in the process of becoming." I'm going to ignore this nonsense about the process of becoming for now, because that's another Martin Heidegger type idea, being and becoming. We're going to set that aside because that is a very long, very separate podcast about that type of philosophical thinking, which we are not going to talk about Dasein today. This whole thing makes no sense to me, and there's no case to be made here for what she's saying, and how this typology is derived and validated in this paper is not described at all. This whole set of nonsense she describes here makes no sense to me and is beyond me. Quote, "How then should the nurse reconcile this with the social and or professional responsibility to control and manipulate the environmental variables and even the behavior of the person who is a patient in order to maintain or restore a steady state? If a human being is assumed to be free to choose and chooses behavior outside of accepted norms, how will this affect the action taken in the therapeutic use of self by the nurse? What choices must the nurse make in order to know another self in an authentic relation apart from the category of patient, even when categorizing for the purpose of treatment is essential to the process of nursing?" Unquote. Those are very good questions. I actually commend, I don't think it matters because she's either ancient or she's dead by now, but I would say I would commend her thinking here, because this is an important clinical set of questions about how to reconcile our values with the values of patients. The values of clinicians sometimes clash with the values of patients, and patients are going to do what patients do unless or until they're incapable of doing them. And if we have to make decisions for them, these are really important questions for us to ask. The problem that I have with this in the context of this paper is that there's nowhere here where it's obvious to me that this doesn't fit into either empirical knowledge or her coming forth typology of ethical knowledge. How is this personal knowledge? And of course, I still don't understand how to even delineate personal from empirical or ethical knowledge, and she doesn't describe how she purportedly did that in her dissertation in the early 1970s. But let me tell you, in the early 1970s, there existed ways of doing factor analysis. Quote, yes. Certainly, empirical knowledge is essential to the purpose of nursing, but nursing also requires that we be alert to the fact that models of human nature and their abstract and generalized categories refer to and describe behaviors and traits that groups have in common. These and many other similar considerations are involved in the realm of personal knowledge, which can be broadly categorized as subjective, concrete, and existential. It is concerned with the kind of knowing that promotes wholeness and integrity in the personal encounter, the achievement of engagement rather than detachment, and it denies the manipulative impersonal orientation. Again, this makes absolutely no sense. It's completely nonsensical, and she seems to be trying to make the case that personal knowing is both subjective and concrete, and that there seems to be a conflation between subjectivity and objectivity here, or that we can even derive knowledge, objective knowledge, from subjectivity, which is a whole other philosophical concept that's filled chapters and even volumes of texts in philosophical libraries, which she does nothing to justify or argue for here. And all of these things are supposed to fall under the same category: subjective, concrete, existential. And how existential has anything to do with knowledge from personal experience at all is also beyond me. And I can't get over the fact that there was no validation study at any point to discuss how these things are related to one another. There's just no justification for any of this theoretically whatsoever. So we come to the very last thing here. This is ethics, the moral component of nursing knowledge, the fourth category in Carper's typology of nursing knowledge. Quote, moral dilemmas arise in situations of ambiguity and uncertainty, when the consequences of one's actions are difficult to predict and traditional principles and ethical codes offer no help or seem to result in contradiction. Fine. But how this is a different subclassification of a way of knowing escapes me. And how nursing ethics is distinct from others' morality, other fields, other disciplines, other professionals, other clinicians even, and how that at any point encompasses a different form of knowledge also escapes me. Quote, the fundamental pattern of knowing identified here as the ethical component of nursing is focused on matters of obligation or what ought to be done. Knowledge of morality goes beyond simply knowing the norms or ethical codes of the discipline. It includes all voluntary actions that are deliberate and subject to the judgment of right and wrong, including judgments of moral value in relation to motives, intentions, and traits of character. Nursing is deliberate action or a series of actions planned and implemented to accomplish defined goals. Both goals and actions involve choices made in part on the basis of normative judgments, both particular and general. On occasion, the principles and norms by which such choices are made may be in conflict. Okay. How this relates to knowledge that is somehow different from the empirical is beyond me. These choices are made to seem as though they are clinical decisions rather than ethical decisions, but it's all a little bit vague and unclear to me. Much of the current practice reflects an attitude of value attached to the goal of independence and indicates nursing actions to assist patients in assuming full responsibility for themselves at the earliest possible moment, or to enable them to retain responsibility to the last possible moment. Even if that's true, and there's no reason for us to believe that it is true based on this because there's no justification for it, yet again, how does this relate to ethics? And how does this relate to the ways of knowing through ethics? It escapes me. And even if it were true that this is the case, how this relates to her typology of knowledge is also confusing to me. The ethical pattern of knowing in nursing requires an understanding of different philosophical positions regarding what is good, what ought to be desired, what is right, of different ethical frameworks devised for dealing with the complexities of moral judgments and of various orientations to the notion of obligation. I have no idea what she means by that. I don't know if she knows what she means by that. Moral choices to be made must then be considered in terms of specific actions to be taken in specific concrete situations. The examination of the standards, codes, and values by which we decide what is morally right should result in a greater awareness of what is involved in making moral choices and being responsible for the choices made. I do not think that she is describing how this constitutes a form of knowledge, and she's really just describing a bunch of ethical conundrums in a really vague, non-specific way that makes her sound even more confused and confusing. She then goes on to describe how to use her patterns of knowing. I'm going to skip this whole section for the most part because it is irrelevant and useless because it's all predicated on the sort of findings, the so-called findings that she described that I just went over. I want to say one more thing, though, before I close out here about the ethical way of knowing. Maybe you could be more charitable and say ethical mode of knowing. The whole idea of knowledge in ethics, as in the implication that there is some truth to be found in ethical principles, is a philosophically fraught idea and falls prey to the fact-value distinction as delineated by Hume. And the idea is that just because something is a certain way does not mean that it ought to be. Why? The is-ought distinction, the fact-value distinction. There is a separation, a gap that cannot be closed between facts and values per se. They are indelibly different according to Hume, and there are some competing ideas in this space, but not very many good ones, and they're very difficult to make, and she makes none of them. So the fact that she's even trying to categorize ethics as a form of knowing truth is already philosophically fraught and problematic, even if she did try to make arguments to that effect, which she didn't. So I'm just going to recap and tell you again her four-dimensional typology of nursing knowledge. The first mode or way of knowing in nursing, according to Carper's ways of knowing, which is as far as I can tell, the only one that makes a lick of sense, is empirical nursing science. Number two is artistic or aesthetic ways of knowing, the art of nursing. Sure. Number three is personal knowledge or personal ways of knowing, which, having read this several times through, I take to mean the personal experiences you have in interaction between nurses and patients, but how that's differentiable from empirical experiences, she does not make a strong enough case for me to buy. So whatever. And either way, it doesn't matter if she makes a good enough philosophical case for any of these things, because she's not made any theory construction arguments from a validation study standpoint to actually justify any of this. This is all opinion. The last one is the moral ways of knowing, or the ethical mode of knowing, or however you want to describe the ethics and morals based dimension of knowledge according to Carper's ways of knowing, which falls prey to the fact-value distinction, the is-ought distinction, which that gap can hardly be traversed without some difficult philosophical work, none of which she ever bothered to do, at least not in this paper, and I've not seen anything to the contrary from her anywhere else either. Again, maybe some of this is described in her dissertation work from the early 1970s, but I can't find her dissertation. I have no idea where to find it, and I don't know what to make of that, except to say that this is a seminal paper in nursing theory. It's one of the most important things that has ever been published in our field, and there is no justification for anything in this paper beyond her opinion. Let me summarize my takeaway from this paper. Are you ready? She read a bunch of other philosophers superficially and synthesized their ideas out of context to fit her agenda and her opinions, and wrote them down. And maybe she had some, influence with other people in our field such that she got it published in a relatively important journal in our field. And because it spoke to and resonated with people who read it uncritically or who didn't bother to read it at all, it's now considered the fundamental pillar of what it means that nursing epistemology is its own subdiscipline.